There is a place in the mountains of Colorado that most people have never heard of. No signs point to it. No tourists visit it. No one who goes inside ever comes back to tell you what it feels like. From the outside, it looks like a collection of gray buildings sitting quietly in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by razor wire, surrounded by silence, surrounded by mountains that don't care. But inside those walls, something happens that the world rarely gets to see. Men sit alone, day after day, year after year. Some of them have been waiting for over a decade, waiting for a single phone call, a single letter, a single decision from a judge thousands of miles away. And some of them are waiting for something else entirely, something that has a date, a time, and a room. This is the story of what happens to a man when the government decides he must die, and how he spends his final days on Earth inside one of the most secretive prison systems in the world. What you are about to hear is not a movie. It is not fiction. Every single detail in this video is documented, verified, and real. And by the end of it, you will never think about justice the same way again. If this is already making you think, you haven't seen anything yet, hit subscribe and stay with us, because what comes next will stop you cold. Let's start at the beginning. The place is called ADX Florence. ADX stands for Administrative Maximum. It sits in Fremont County, Colorado, about 2 hours south of Denver. It opened in 1994, and from the very first day, people inside the prison system knew what it was built for. It was built to hold the people that no other prison could handle. Not just dangerous people, the most dangerous, the ones who had escaped, the ones who had killed guards, the ones who had organized violence from behind bars, the ones who, even locked up, the government was afraid of. A former warden once described it this way. He said it was a clean version of hell. He said it was, in many ways, much worse than death. Think about that for a second. A man who ran the place, who had the keys, who could leave whenever he wanted, and he said it was worse than dying. Now imagine being told you have to stay there permanently. The cells at ADX Florence are small, about the size of a large bathroom, 7 feet wide, 12 feet long. Each cell has a concrete desk, a concrete bed, and a small window that lets in just enough light to remind you that the outside world exists. Inmates spend 23 hours a day inside that cell. Some spend 24. They eat there, they sleep there, they think there, they talk to themselves there, because there is often no one else to talk to. For 1 hour a day, some inmates are allowed outside. But outside is not a field or a yard. It's a slightly larger concrete box with a metal grate above it so you can see the sky. Just the sky. Nothing else. No phones. No television in most cases. No contact with other inmates. No hugs. No handshakes. No human touch of any kind. Researchers who study prisons have a name for what this does to a person's mind. They call it death row syndrome. And the name is not an accident. Prolonged isolation, being alone for months, then years, then decades, begins to do something to the human brain. Anxiety shows up first. Then comes paranoia. Then depression so heavy that some men say they can no longer feel anything at all. Some hear voices. Some lose track of time entirely, unable to tell if it is morning or night, Monday or Saturday, winter or summer. The suicide rate among death row inmates in the United States is roughly 113 per every 100,000 people. To put that in perspective, the national average is about 14. Death row inmates kill themselves at a rate nearly 8 times higher than the general population. And yet, here's the strange part. Here's the thing that makes the story more complicated than it first appears. Some of these men are still fighting hard, filing documents, writing letters, making phone calls, begging courts to hear them one more time, because something is happening inside those cells that most people on the outside would never expect. Some of these men do not want to die, and some of them do. We will come back to that, but first, you need to understand who exactly is inside ADX Florence, because the names on that list will surprise you. One of them is Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. You may know him as the younger of the two brothers responsible for the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013. 3 people were killed that day. Hundreds were injured. Some lost limbs. He was sentenced to death. He is held at ADX Florence specifically because the government considers him too dangerous and too high profile for a regular federal prison. He is there not just as punishment, but as a message, a statement. This is where people like you go. But Tsarnaev is not alone, and his story is not the one we are following today. Because there is a process, a very specific, very deliberate process that begins long before any execution ever takes place. A process that most people, including most lawyers, most journalists, and most Americans know almost nothing about. It starts not with a needle, not with a room, not with a date. It starts with a letter. When the United States government decides it is time for a federal inmate to be executed, the first official step is a formal notification. The prisoner receives a written document that informs him of the method that will be used to end his life. Just a letter, quiet, official, delivered like any other piece of mail. Can you imagine receiving that letter? Most people, if you ask them, would assume the worst. They would assume the inmate falls apart, screams, breaks down completely, and sometimes that does happen. But researchers who have studied this, lawyers who have sat with these men, prison chaplains who have spent years inside these facilities, they will tell you something that almost nobody talks about. They will tell you that some men, after receiving that letter, become the most calm they have been in years. This detail matters because it means that at some point, at some specific, unannounced point, an inmate who has spent years, sometimes decades, inside a cell in Colorado will be moved, transferred, taken from the only world they have known for years, and transported to a different facility in a different state to complete the sentence. That transfer is not public. The date is not announced in advance. It happens quietly, under heavy security, with very little warning given even to the inmate himself. And when he arrives at Terre Haute, the final countdown begins. It is called Death Watch. Let's go back to that room. The one with no windows. The one where time moves differently. The one where a man sits and waits, knowing that the calendar on the wall is no longer his friend. Death Watch has begun. And the first thing you need to understand about Death Watch is that it is not what most people imagine. People hear that phrase, and they picture something dramatic, something loud, something cinematic. But the reality is quieter than that. Much quieter, and somehow, that makes it worse. The inmate is placed in a single cell inside a special unit at USP Terre Haute. This unit exists for one purpose only. Everyone inside it, the guards, the staff, the chaplains who walk those halls, everyone knows exactly why they are there. There is no pretending. There is no distraction. The purpose of this place is written into every brick of every wall. A man is going to die here, and right now, he is sitting in a chair, eating a meal, watching the clock, thinking thoughts that no researcher, no journalist, no documentary has ever been fully able to capture. Because how do you capture what it feels like to know? Not to guess, not to fear, but to know. The guards who have worked Death Watch, and some of them have spoken about it in interviews over the years, describe it as one of the most psychologically difficult assignments in all of law enforcement. Not because of anything violent, not because of any danger, but because of the silence. One former corrections officer described it this way. He said that after his first death watch assignment, he went home and sat in his car in his driveway for 40 minutes. Just sitting. He said he could not explain what he was feeling. It was not sadness exactly. It was not guilt. It was something else. Something he did not have a word for. He never fully recovered from the experience. Now, think about the man inside the cell. If this story is hitting different, you are not alone. Subscribe so you never miss what we uncover next, because this is only getting deeper. During Death Watch, the inmate's daily routine changes completely. At ADX Florence, there was almost nothing. No interaction, no stimulation, a concrete box, and silence. But during Death Watch, the government's own regulations require something different. Something that, on the surface, almost looks like kindness. Visits are allowed. Under Federal Bureau of Prisons policy, the inmate may receive visits from immediate family members, his legal team, and a spiritual advisor. These visits can happen in the days leading up to the execution. For some inmates, this is the first time in years, sometimes decades, that they have been in the same room with the family member without thick glass between them. The first time they have heard a familiar voice without a telephone receiver pressed against their ear. Imagine going 10 years without a real hug. And then, in the final days of your life, someone who loves you is allowed to sit close. Maybe hold your hand. Maybe just be there. It sounds like a gift. And in some ways, it is. But there is something deeply cruel about it too. Because the visit always ends. The family member always has to stand up, walk to the door, and leave. And the inmate watches them go, knowing that the next time he sees them, if he sees them again at all, will be through a window in a different kind of room. Some families choose not to come, not because they don't love the person inside, but because they cannot bear it. They cannot sit across from someone they love and pretend that goodbye is just goodbye. Some inmates ask their families not to come. They do not want their mother, their sister, their child to carry that image for the rest of their lives. These are the decisions that happen behind closed doors. The ones that never make the news. The ones that are heavier than anything a courtroom ever produces. And while all of this is happening, while families are traveling, while lawyers are making final calls, while the inmate is sitting in that cell, something else is happening simultaneously. Something that runs parallel to all of it, like a second story playing out at the same time. The legal machine is still moving. Even on death watch, even in the final days, the inmate's attorneys are still working, filing last-minute appeals, calling judges, petitioning the Supreme Court, reaching out to the governor, or in federal cases, directly to the president, asking for clemency. Clemency means mercy. It means asking the most powerful person in the country to look at this case one more time and decide that death is not the answer. It does not mean freedom. It usually means a sentence of life in prison without parole instead. Most clemency requests are denied, but not all of them. And this is the part of the story where things get complicated in a way most people never consider. Because sometimes a man sitting in death watch, days away from execution, gets a phone call. And the phone call changes everything. It has happened. It is documented. It is real. In 2021, just before a series of federal executions were carried out in the final days of one administration, lawyers were working around the clock. Phone calls were being made at 2 in the morning. Judges were being woken up. The entire legal system was being pushed to its absolute edge. For some of those inmates, it made no difference. The execution happened as scheduled, but the fact that it could change the fact that right up until the final hours, there is still a chance is something that lives inside every inmate in that unit. Every single one of them knows that the phone could still ring, that a fax could come through, that somewhere in a building far away, a person with a pen could change everything. And most of them still hope, even the ones who pretend not to. Hope is the last thing to die, sometimes literally. Now, it's talk about the final 24 hours. Because this is where the story changes tone completely. The last day is structured, deliberate, almost ritualistic in its precision. The Bureau of Prisons has a detailed protocol, a step-by-step process for how the final hours of a federal execution are supposed to unfold. And when you hear the details, it will feel strange. because some of it sounds almost normal. The inmate is offered a special meal, not the last meal of legend, the elaborate, expensive feast that movies and television have turned into a dramatic moment. The reality is more modest than that. The federal government does not have a specific dollar cap on the final meal. Unlike some states, the inmate can make a request, a real request, something specific, something he wants. And the kitchen staff, people who work in a prison, people who serve food to inmates every single day, will do their best to fulfill it. Some men ask for simple things: a cheeseburger, fried chicken, a specific type of dessert their mother used to make, a soft drink they have not tasted in years. One inmate asked for a single olive. That was it. Just an olive. No one fully understood why. He didn't explain it, and no one asked. That is the thing about the final meal. It is not really about the food. It is about choice. In a place where every single detail of a person's life has been controlled, scheduled, monitored, and decided by someone else, the final meal is one of the last moments where the inmate gets to choose something for himself. And that matters more than any menu item ever could. What would your final meal be? Not morbid, just human. Drop it in the comments. You might be surprised what people say. After the meal, the inmate is allowed to shower. He is given clean clothes, simple ones, a shirt, pants, nothing special, but clean. The chaplain comes. This is one of the most important figures in the entire process, and one of the least talked about. The prison chaplain, or a spiritual advisor chosen by the inmate himself, is allowed to be present, to pray, to sit, to speak, or to stay silent, depending on what the inmate needs. For some inmates, faith is everything in these final hours. They pray with intensity. They quote scripture. They speak about what they believe comes next with a certainty that surprises even the chaplains who have seen this many times. For others, there is no faith. There is just a person sitting in a room, trying to make peace with something that cannot be made peaceful. The chaplain does not judge. That is not his job. His job is simply to be there. And being there in that room that night, it changes people. Chaplains who have done this work speak about it with a kind of quiet gravity. They choose their words carefully. They never say it was easy. They never say it was routine. They say it was the most human thing they have ever been part of. Now here is where the story takes a turn that almost no documentary has ever focused on. Most people assume that an inmate facing execution spends his final hours in terror, shaking, crying, unable to function, and sometimes that is true. But researchers who have studied final statements, the last words that inmates are allowed to speak before the execution is carried out, found something that completely changed their understanding of this moment. They analyzed 240 final statements from Texas alone, spanning over 15 years. And what they found was not what they expected. The most common theme in those final statements was not fear, it was love. Inmates used their last words to tell people they loved them, to thank the people who had stood by them, to apologize, to forgive, to say the things that years behind bars had made it impossible to say out loud. The second most common theme was spirituality, belief in something beyond this room, beyond this moment, beyond the needle and the clock and the witnesses watching through the glass. And the third most common theme, the one that hit researchers the hardest, was peace. Men who had spent decades in some of the harshest conditions a human being can survive. Men who had been through trials, appeals, denials, isolation, and the slow grinding weight of knowing how their story ends. Men who had every reason to be broken. Many of them, in their final words, described feeling at peace. Not all of them. Let's be clear about that. Some final statements were angry. Some were declarations of innocence, spoken with a desperation that is heartbreaking to read. Some were barely coherent, the product of minds that had not survived the decades intact. But the peace was there, more often than anyone expected, more often than the system that created these conditions probably deserves. And that raises a question, a quiet, uncomfortable, deeply important question. What does it mean when a man who is about to be executed by the state is more at peace than the people watching it happen? Because the witnesses, the corrections officers, the official observers, the victims' family members who sometimes choose to be present, many of them carry what happened in that room for the rest of their lives. The guards talk about it in hushed tones years later. The officers who are part of the execution team, the ones who are responsible for the physical process, are offered counseling afterward. Because the government knows. The government has always known. This is not something a person just gets over. And that is where we are right now, on the edge of the final room, the final moment, the part of the story that everything else has been building toward. We know the cell, we know the waiting, we know the visits and the meal and the chaplain and the final words. But there is still one more thing, one more chapter, the room itself, what happens inside it, what it looks like, what it feels like, what the inmate experiences in those final minutes, and what the science actually tells us about those last moments of consciousness. And there is one detail, one specific, documented, rarely discussed detail about what happens in the final seconds that will make you stop whatever you are doing and just sit with it. That is coming next. There is a room at USP Terre Haute that most people will never see. It has no number on the door. It does not appear on any public map of the facility. If you were walking the halls of that prison and someone did not tell you what was behind that door, you would have no way of knowing. But everyone inside that building knows. They have always known. The room is small, smaller than most people imagine. It is clean, carefully maintained. The walls are painted a neutral color, nothing aggressive. Nothing warm, just a color that does not ask anything of you. In the center of the room is a table. It is narrow and flat, slightly raised, with straps attached to it. The straps are designed to hold a person still, not because the person will fight. Most of them don't, but because the protocol requires it, because the process must be controlled, because this is, above everything else, a procedure, and procedures have rules. To the left of the table, behind a window, is a room where witnesses sit. There can be up to 13 of them, representatives from the government, a spiritual advisor if the inmate requested one, members of the media, usually 1 or 2 reporters selected to represent the public, and sometimes, if they chose to come, members of the victim's family. They sit in chairs, they watch through the glass, they do not speak. To the right, hidden behind a separate wall, is where the medical team works. You cannot see them from inside the main room. They can see everything. They are watching monitors. They are watching the clock. They are waiting for a signal. This is the execution chamber of the United States federal government, and at some point on the scheduled day, the door opens. The inmate walks in, or sometimes, he is brought in, supported, because the legs do not always cooperate when the mind knows what is coming. This is not weakness. This is biology. This is what the human body does when it understands something that the human mind is still trying to process. He is helped onto the table. The straps are secured, not roughly, not with aggression. The officers who do this have been trained to be calm, to be professional, to treat this moment with the specific kind of seriousness that has no name in any training manual. An intravenous line is inserted into his arm, sometimes both arms, as a backup. The tube runs through a small opening in the wall to where the medical team is waiting, and then the room gets very quiet. Now, pause here for a second, because before we go any further, there is something you need to know, something that was debated in courtrooms across this country for years, something that lawyers argued about, that scientists testified about, that Supreme Court justices wrote long opinions about. The question was simple, and it was devastating. Does it hurt? The method used in federal executions today is lethal injection, specifically, a single drug called pentobarbital. This was not always the case. For years, a 3-drug combination was used: a sedative, a paralytic agent, and a drug to stop the heart. The problem with that combination, which courts examined very carefully, was this. The paralytic agent, the drug that stops the body from moving, also stops the inmate from showing any outward sign of pain, which means that if something went wrong with the sedative, if the person was not fully unconscious, they would be unable to move, unable to speak, unable to signal to anyone in the room that they were suffering. They would appear peaceful. They would look exactly like someone who was asleep, but inside, they might not be. This is not speculation. This is what medical experts testified about in federal court. This is what caused years of legal battles over the method of execution. This is what made some anesthesiologists refuse to participate in the process entirely. The question of whether lethal injection causes suffering is one that the legal system has never fully resolved. Courts have ruled that it does not constitute cruel and unusual punishment. But courts and science are not always the same thing. What the science says is more complicated and more unsettling. What we do know is that pentobarbital, used correctly and in sufficient doses, causes unconsciousness rapidly. Most medical professionals agree that when administered properly, the inmate loses consciousness within seconds. Seconds. That word does a lot of work in this conversation. Let's go back to the room. The inmate is on the table. The line is in his arm. The witnesses are behind the glass. The medical team is behind the wall. The warden is present. The warden is the person who gives the final signal. Before that signal is given, one last check happens. One final, extraordinary step in this procedure that most people have never heard about. A phone call is made. From inside the execution chamber, or just before the process begins, a direct line is confirmed to the offices of the Attorney General of the United States. This line exists for one reason. If at the last possible moment, even now, even here, a court issues a stay of execution, that information needs to reach this room immediately. The phone is not a formality. It has rung before. Not often, but it has rung. There are documented cases in American history where an inmate was already strapped to the table when word came through that the execution had been stopped, where the straps were undone, where the line was removed, where the inmate was helped off the table and taken back to a cell. Can you imagine that? Being on that table, and then getting up and walking away. What do you do with that? Where do you put it? How do you sleep that night? These are questions that don't have answers, but they are real questions that real people have had to live with. When no call comes, the warden gives the signal. The drug begins to move through the line. And here is the detail. The one specific, documented, rarely discussed detail that we promised you. The one that researchers noticed when they began studying the data from multiple executions over multiple decades. In the final moments, in the seconds between when the drug enters the bloodstream and when consciousness fades, many inmates do the same thing. They look up. Not at the ceiling. Not at the witnesses behind the glass. Not at the warden or the chaplain or anyone in the room. They look up in a way that has no clear direction. A way that suggests they are looking at something that no one else in the room can see. Prison chaplains who have witnessed executions talk about this. Corrections officers who have stood in that room talk about this. It appears in accounts, in memoirs, in testimony. Again and again and again. No one can explain it. The scientist will tell you it is the brain responding to the drug. The neurons firing in patterns that produce visual effects. A physiological response to rapid sedation. The chaplains will tell you something different. And the truth is, no one in that room, not the warden, not the medical team, not the witnesses, knows for certain what the person on the table is experiencing in those final seconds. That uncertainty has never gone away. It lives inside everyone who has ever stood in that room. It follows them home. It sits with them at dinner. It wakes them up at 3 in the morning years later. Because taking a life, even a life that the law has determined must be taken, is not something the human mind processes cleanly. It does not file itself neatly away. It stays. It lingers. It asks questions that have no answers. Now here is where the story pulls back, where we zoom out from that room and look at the bigger picture. Because this documentary is not just about one man on one table on one day. It is about a system that has been running in this country for centuries. A system that most Americans support in theory and know almost nothing about in practice. The United States is one of the very few developed nations in the world that still carries out the death penalty. Most of Europe abandoned it decades ago. Canada ended it. Australia ended it. Even many countries with far less stable governments have moved away from it. The debate about whether that is right or wrong is not what we are here to settle today. People on both sides of that debate have arguments that deserve to be heard. Victims' families who found something like closure in an execution, and victims' families who watched an execution happen and felt nothing change. Both exist. Both are real. What we are here to do is show you what the process actually looks like. From the inside, from the human level, from the place where policy becomes flesh and bone, and a man lying on a table in a small room in Indiana. Because here is what most people do not know. Here's the detail that gets lost in every political debate about capital punishment. The people who carry out these executions are not monsters. They are corrections officers. They are people who took a job to maintain safety and order inside a prison. And at some point, their job description quietly included this. Most of them did not sign up for it explicitly. Most of them did not fully understand what it would cost them until after it was done. There are officers who requested to be part of execution teams because they believed in what they were doing, who felt that their role was just and necessary. There are others who participated once and never again, who transferred to different facilities, who left the profession entirely. The system continues regardless. It does not pause for the people inside it. It does not ask how anyone is feeling. It schedules a date, follows its protocol, and moves on. And somewhere in Colorado, in a gray building surrounded by razor wire and mountains, the men who have not yet been scheduled continue to sit, continue to wait, continue to live inside a space that a former warden called worse than death, while the world outside goes on without them, while children grow up, while seasons change, while everything moves forward except for them. Some of them are still filing appeals, still writing letters, still believing that a judge somewhere will read one more document and see something that no one else has seen. Some of them have made peace, in the specific, strange, deeply human way that we described earlier, the way that surprises everyone who witnesses it. And some of them are doing something that nobody talks about, something that is perhaps the most quietly extraordinary thing that happens inside these walls. Some of them are helping each other, through walls, through vents, through the narrow gaps under doors, passing notes, calling out in the night, sharing what little wisdom they have gathered in years of sitting alone with their thoughts. Men who have been stripped of almost everything: their freedom, their privacy, their future, their identity, finding ways to remain human, to reach toward each other across the concrete and the silence. Not because the system encourages it. It doesn't. Not because it changes anything. It doesn't change the date on the calendar. But because being human is the one thing that has not been taken from them yet. And they know, perhaps better than anyone alive, how precious that is. This is the story of ADX Florence, of USP Terre Haute, of the process that begins with a letter and ends in a small room with a narrow table and a phone that may or may not ring. This is the story of what justice looks like when you get close enough to see it clearly. It is not simple. It is not clean. It does not resolve neatly into a feeling that makes you certain you know what is right. That discomfort you are feeling right now, that is the point. Because the moment we stop feeling uncomfortable about this, the moment it becomes routine. The moment we stop asking questions is the moment we have lost something important about ourselves as a society. Keep asking, keep looking, keep being the kind of person who wants to understand what is really happening behind the walls that were built so you would never have to think about it. If this documentary made you think, made you feel, or made you see something you have never considered before, share it. Not because we asked you to, but because these stories deserve to be heard. Subscribe for more documentaries that go where most channels won't. And if there is a story you think needs to be told, drop it in the comments below. We read every single one.